communicating with care. We will begin just with some introductions. Our team, as we go through today's presentation, folks will just say who they are, but want to hear from you, our audience members, in the chat now that it is functional. So please do drop your name, your organization, and what brings you here today, what interests you in the topic, and maybe how you relate to or work with notices in your work. Just a quick look at our approach to the day. We'll start by introducing ourselves, the Public Policy Lab, and then we'll get to addressing the why here, why benefits notices matter, and why it is important to take on the work of designing these communications with care. We'll then zoom in on some of the findings from our recent project with the Arizona Department of Economic Security, and share PPL's best practices for notice design that we've developed over a few recent projects. And finally, we will have a moment for Q&A, so please do keep those questions coming into the chat. Our hope is that by the end of today's webinar, you'll have some really clear best practices and some inspiration to take into your own work of evaluating and improving benefits notices. Before we dig into the substance of our work, we want to step back and just say a little more about who we are. Excuse me. We're the Public Policy Lab, which can be a mouthful, so we often use our acronym PPL. I'm having some noise on my end. Isabel, I wonder if you can jump in here.
Yeah. So the Public Policy Lab, we are a nonprofit design lab. We're headquartered in Brooklyn, New York, but we've got team members on the West Coast, including Andrew. And we're a team of designers and researchers that partners with government agencies and nonprofit organizations, foundations to design both policy and services. And we do all this with a focus on the experiences of low-income and marginalized people. In our specific project that we're going to talk about today, our work with Arizona's DES, we brought together this team with expertise in visual design, plain language writing, policy analysis. And as Andrew mentioned, we'll all introduce ourselves when we speak. Well, I'll introduce myself later. But this is ultimately the team that worked on this project together. So with that, we're going to turn to this topic of why we're talking about notices today and why this really matters. Andrew, do you want to come back in here? Or you want me to keep going?
Yeah, let me see if it keeps quiet on my end. We want to introduce you to Carmen. Carmen represents not just one person, but the type of people we interacted with when we were in Arizona. Carmen is a mother of three who works 2 jobs to pay the bills. In a typical week, she spends some time as a shopper for Instacart and some time providing childcare for a neighbor. Carmen relies on SNAP to help feed her family every month. One day, Carmen receives a notice in the mail, and it says she needs to provide information about her income to continue getting SNAP. It instructs her to send proof of how many hours she works per week, but she feels confused because she works different hours every week. So the more she reads, the more overwhelmed she ultimately feels, and she has the sense that she's really going to need some support to respond to the letter. Carmen tries calling her state agency, but she's on hold for several hours, and she has to hang up to go to work. She feels confused and frustrated and scared by this interaction. And that's because she really needs her SNAP benefits to afford groceries, but she doesn't know where to go from here. And now I want to step back and say around 1 in 3 Americans rely on some form of government assistance. And many of those millions of Americans will experience what Carmen does here: confusion, frustration, and fear when they receive notices about their benefits. These are some of the dominant themes we heard as we spoke with clients in Arizona. And we should say notices are necessary. They are the primary way that agencies communicate eligibility and program information to their clients, and they play an essential role They're translating policy decisions and process requirements into real world actions and outcomes. At their worst, notices can function as a barrier and a barrier to these really essential services provided by agencies. But when thoughtfully designed, notices can serve as a guide, and as a guide that is truly informative and supportive, and that helps clients through the actions that they need to take. So we are here today to share some practices, how you can design notices that serve as a guide to clients like Carmen. And with that, I will pass the microphone to my colleague, Karina. Karina?
Hello, everyone. My name is Karina. I'm an analyst at the Public Policy Lab. And in this project, my role has been predominantly working on the visual design templates of these notices that we've been working on. And in this section, I'm going to be talking to you about our work that we did with Arizona's Department of Economic Security. And so our partners at DES in recent years have been focused on improving the client's experience for their benefit programs. And so that included improvements to forms and applications. And more recently, they launched an online benefits management platform called A to Z Arizona. But the leaders at DES wanted to extend those improvements to the notices that inform the agency's clients about the benefit programs and what the client's responsibilities were while receiving benefits. And so together, DES and the Family and Workers Fund selected us to lead the work in the modernization of their notices. So we're very thankful for the opportunity and the financial support from the two organizations. And so when we began this project, we established three goals for this effort. Our first goal was to improve the clarity, tone, and action-oriented design of the SNAP and childcare assistance notices. Andrew, if you could start next. Our second goal was to increase administrative efficiency for DES staff, such as the policy analysts, systems teams, and eligibility specialists. And our third goal was to reduce the prevalence of client-driven errors relating to notices and the surrounding communication materials that they would receive in the mail. And so last year, back in February, DES policy teams shared with us their full set of notices. And so when we counted it up, it was 167 SNAP notices and 48 childcare notices. And so as we began to tackle how to redesign these set of notices, it was really important that we acknowledge the various competing requirements that we needed to balance while moving this work forward. And so we established these four distinct lenses that we kept in the forefront of our minds as we were conducting the work throughout all stages of the project, right from the very start in research to the final redesign of the notices. And so starting with policy compliance, first and foremost, very important, notices must comply with federal and state regulation that govern their content. And so we really wanted to make sure that in our redesign phase, we were paying particular attention to writing fully compliant notices before handing off to the agency. And so in the wake of all these shifting policies and changes that are happening, and in particular HR1, kind of halfway into this project, we really turned our attention to how our notice redesign work could reduce payment error rates for Arizona. And so with this in mind, we wanted to make sure that we fully understood these policy changes while writing the notices that were compliant. And so to ensure that we had that compliance box ticked, we collaborated with Elizabeth Silberman, a former USDA regional administrator and current independent consultant, to assess our SNAP notices for compliance and error rate reduction. So I'm going to pass the mic over now to Elizabeth to introduce herself.
Thanks, Karina. Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Silberman, and I'm a consultant working with PPL on this project, serving as the policy expert for the notices. So prior to doing consulting work, I spent more than 30 years at the Food and Nutrition Service and served as the SNAP policy director for more than 10 of those years. So working on notices was a big part of my work during that time. And just to give you a little bit more background on why it became so important, around 2010, there was a new measure that was introduced into the program called Case and Procedural Error Rates, or the CAPER measure. And that really shed a light on how SNAP notices really needed some improvement in terms of quality, that poor notices could lead to access and accuracy issues. So during that time, we released a lot of policy guidance and made a lot of strides in working with states on model notices. And those kinds of improvements have shown that they can have significant impact on reducing participant confusion, supporting timely action by households, and supporting eligibility workers to administer the policy more consistently. And all these factors can really improve access and accuracy for the program. So it's been great to work on this project and work specifically with Arizona on their notices. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. So yeah, honestly, it was really great working with Elizabeth and a really great partner in this project. And so moving on to then the next lens that we were working with was operational readiness. And so we collaborated with DES's systems teams to understand the backend systems that generate and send the notices. And with the two programs that we were working with, SNAP and childcare assistance, both had very different systems in which the notice was created in. And so for childcare assistance, we were limited in the design capabilities due to their mainframe systems that they were produced in. And so certain constraints such as one page, we could only use one page for these notices. We couldn't extend beyond one page. There was a limiter character count that we had to work within for that one page limit, and including this all caps courier font. That was the only formatting that we could work with in terms of the visual design. While on the other hand, for our SNAP notices, there was a much more flexible design system in place. These notices could be multiple pages long and are designed in a software with the same design capabilities as Microsoft Word. So we had a little bit more room here to push the visual design of these notices more than the childcare assistants. Accessible design is another lens we were working through, and of course, it's a very key component of our work at PPL. We have over 15 years experience delivering human-centered design projects, and with that experience, we've developed and evolved our content and visual design best practices. And so the Arizona project builds directly on a few recent partnerships where we honed our approach to redesigning client-facing applications and letters. And so just to name a few, we worked with the New York City's Department of Housing Preservation Development on their housing assistance forms. We also worked with the US Department of Housing and Urban Development after creating the New York Housing Preservation Development forms to make more client-friendly templates for housing authorities across nationwide. And more recently, we've worked with the state of Michigan, where we designed templates for their court forms. So with that knowledge, bringing that also back into the Arizona project, understanding what accessible design really means. And so then finally, our last lens that we were working through was client experience. And once again, at PPL, the client has always been at the front of our minds when we design any service or product. And so we wanted to understand the experiences from the people in Arizona who received these notices and gathered their feedback on language, tone, and layout decisions. And so we traveled to Arizona multiple times to test and prototype the notices at various different stages throughout the project. And during those sessions, we would ask for feedback on layout and tone preferences, as well as testing how accurately clients would fill out forms that we redesigned, or assessing the reading comprehension accuracy of a notice. So these were all really, really important. These 4 lenses were all really important in kind of creating and establishing these new redesigned notices. And so we now have compiled this short video this was back in one of our first research engagements that we did out in the field, where we were in Arizona meeting with people and current DES clients. And we got some first impressions of the original notices that they would receive in the mail. And also we did some co-designing workshops too, where we would kind of workshop with them about different redesigned layout and language options that we were thinking about at the time. So let's hear from some of the voices.
I just saw the benefits approved and I looked for the amount, to be honest.
So all the other information
I
didn't
really
seem relevant.
didn't pay attention to.
When I read this part of the sentence, we made a change to your case. What change? What change was made? It says why the change was made. I would want to know, how did you get the new information? Why did you get this new information? What prompted this new information? Is it something that I didn't provide, should have provided, right?
I think this one kind of explains it a little bit more. So I'm almost like contradicting what I said though, because I said it was like too many words over here, and this is actually more words, but I really don't know why I like this one better, but I definitely do.
So right off the bat, like abbreviations, like NA, I've always understood that as non-applicable.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing that comes to my head was like nutrition assistance non-applicable work requirements.
I just never like caps. It just seems like it's demanding. I think even in text messages or even just in some type of writing, that's what I feel off of this one with the caps. Everything it's listed on here, it's repetitive and it's also overwhelming, and like I feel that it's already online, then why do you want to put it on a piece of paper again? And it kind of throws off your thinking or the purpose of this letter. Like you just wrote a bunch of definitions, but you kind of forget the main thing that's in the front.
I wasn't understanding of what it meant to register for work with a new or renewal application. Like, does that mean I have to reapply for the benefits?
Sometimes like the process and reading all of it just gets very overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And I just kind of check out, or I'll have to read the same thing over and over and over because it doesn't make sense to me. Sometimes the way it's worded is too complex and not simple enough to understand.
Yeah, so this video is a short snippet of the people that we heard from, but just to kind of put everything in a big overview and step back and look at our total engagements, we spend 85 plus hours testing various materials with clients and participants. 67 members of the public were interviewed, and that included 14 Spanish speakers. And we interviewed 24 DES staff, which was the eligibility specialists and policy and systems teams, as well as community-based organization staff as well, to really gather our research, make sure we were covering all our bases and gathering some really great feedback. So now I'm gonna pass the mic over to Isabel to talk a little bit about some of our insights and applications from the research.
Thanks, Karina. And I dropped this in the chat, but as we're talking, if you guys have any questions that come up, you can drop them in the chat or put them in the Q&A little box, and we'll either respond directly in the chat or address them later. So my name is Isabel Bradbury. I already spoke, but I'll introduce myself. I'm a senior analyst at PPL, and I've been leading the SNAP side of this work. So I've had the pleasure of reviewing those 167 SNAP notices and working with Lisbeth to redesign them. And we're going to share 6 insights that we learned from the research and testing with clients that Karina just described. I'm going to share 5 that are relevant to kind of specific notice, language, layout, comprehension choices. And then I'll pass to Maisie for the 6th one, which is more about the notice ecosystem as a whole, and to wrap us up. So first, the first insight is really that first impressions determine next steps. We saw that people really decided how or if to engage with a notice within 2 to 3 seconds of looking at it. And their first reaction was largely driven by visual clarity on the page or their emotional response. So here, on the next slide, you've got a side-by-side of Snap Notice. So the left is the DES original, on the right is our redesigned draft. And we really wanted to highlight the key information that we wanted clients to take in within that crucial 2 to 3 second window. So for example, the notice that we're showing on screen is a notice denying or ending a client's benefits because they didn't provide the information that the agency requested in time. And you can see the original, the title, really emphasizes that denial closure. If you'll go to the next slide, Andrew. So when clients really saw this denial title, they stopped reading and they said, well, I've been denied. This stinks. I can't do anything about this. And they didn't continue engaging with the notice, which means they missed further down on the page that they could actually, it gives them information on that they could submit the missing information now to regain their benefits. So in our redesign, we wanted to lead with this. We wanted to lead with what action the client can actually take. So we changed the title to "We didn't get the information we needed from you." And in the body of the text of the notice, we say, we've denied your application, but right after it says, however, you can still submit the missing information now. And in testing, clients actually kept reading to that point because they weren't blocked by their initial emotional reaction to seeing that denial title. We've got it, yeah. We also used visual design methods to highlight the action needed with this kind of action bar, saying exactly what the main point of the notice is for the client and what the deadline is. We restructured the headers to still stand out on the page with these kind of banners and help clients navigate without that feeling of overwhelm of the all caps that were perceived as aggressive by clients. We also used things like line dividers, bolding, and bulleted lists to space out and structure information so that clients could take in things without that visual overwhelm of crowding. And we used icons to draw the eye to really important sections we wanted to highlight. So a contact, the agency section, so it didn't blend in with the others. So these were some visual design choices we made that helped make that first impression much more manageable and helps clients then be guided to their next steps more seamlessly. The next insight is something we heard really consistently, that people want to be seen as individuals, not numbers in a system, and they want to see evidence of a human touch in the notice, as well as specific information about their case. So here we have a childcare assistance notice. As Karina mentioned earlier, these notices brought a particular challenge of how can we improve language and information architecture within design constraints. So for these, we focused a lot on tone and really front-loading the information clients need to see first. One example here is avoiding using passive voice. So the original might have said, the following information is required for you to continue being eligible. We changed that type of language to, we need more information from you to see if you're eligible for these benefits, making the tone more personal, using active voice to really highlight who needs to do what. We also very intentionally made these feel like a letter from person to person. We say, "Dear so-and-so," using things like "we" to refer to the state agency and "you" to refer to the client, which can go a long way in making clients feel like they're actually, having a connection with this notice, that it's about them specifically. And we also tried to break down sort of complicated or complex program decisions with courtesy and transparency, and simplifying as best we could. For our next insight, it's really about real life is complicated, and oftentimes government forms or notices don't really make space for that on the page. People are coming to these notices with complicated lived experiences, pre-existing mental models, and those really need to be understood and then reflected on the notice. So for example, we have a status update form for childcare assistance, which originally only had one table asking for employment information from the household with 2 rows. And many clients that we spoke to had more than one job. They had a co-parent who also had more than one job. And so their reality really didn't fit into that one table. So in our redesign on the right, we added an extra table, which explicitly asks for an additional parent or caregiver's employment. And this means that there's space for a household where both caregivers have multiple sources of income, and this allows them to report that accurately. Additionally, we kept on running into this mental model in testing where participants would read the word income and they wouldn't think of things like benefits or even like child support as falling under that category. And for those who work in kind of the SNAP space, especially, you can see how this could be a big potential for client error. So we asked participants, show us where you would report a change in your unemployment insurance benefits on this form. The original just said income changes, and they wouldn't think to put it in that section. So for our redesign, we really incorporated this mental model explicitly onto the page. So we named benefits in this header to draw the eye, also to remind them that it's something that they need to report, and then reiterated with bulleted examples other types of employment that might not fall into that category so neatly in their mental model, like self-employment, gig work, child support, gifts from family and friends. The next insight is that vague instructions lead to guesswork. We saw that when people felt like they had to make a judgment call or an interpretation about if something applied to them, they're more likely to leave sections blank, answer inaccurately, or ask for help. And this is a section that these examples are very relevant to error rates. So on the left here, you have an original SNAP form asking for changes in income sources. And it has this kind of open-ended question, what changed? And we see this a lot on government forms. And when we tested this with clients, they gave sort of vague answers like, my job changed or my income changed. And that's not really giving the state agency helpful information. So ultimately, what the question needed to know is this a new income source or is this an income source that has stopped? And so we changed that to be a multiple choice question where clients really are getting a specific option. And the learning here is really, if you need to know something specific, give people specific options to choose from. Similarly, a change report form asking for changes in income and expenses had columns labeled amount, and we saw clients answer this amount question very inconsistently. Some people would write the amount that their income had changed by, some would write the original amount, some would write the new amount. And we can see how this can obviously cause a big headache for agency staff who are looking at this, trying to understand what number they're looking at. So even just a small wording change, like asking for new or current amount, really helped clients report more consistently the accurate answer. This is a learning from our friends at Digital Public Works, who I don't know if they're on the call, but we love to give them a shout out. They have been doing research into income verification for SNAP and looking into challenges around verifying income for clients. And they found many state agencies ask questions around, what's the normal range of hours you work per week, or what are the hours you work per week? And the reality is that many people, like Carmen in our example, work very different hours every week. And so this can lead to them giving a kind of an average or an estimated average, which then ultimately doesn't reflect the numbers that are on their pay stubs and causes a lot of back and forth. So the team at Digital Public Works recommended from their findings that we ask specifically for minimum hours worked per week and maximum hours worked per week to get a range that is much more accurate and specific and avoid people having to give an estimation. And then finally, we know a lot of these notices are actually forms. A lot of them are verification forms that need to go to a third party, like someone's employer or their medical provider. And so we really took steps to add specific instructions about what to do with this form. So how to get third-party verification, stop here, give this to your employer, have them give it back to you. As well as on the bottom there, defining things like gross annual pay. Many households don't know what that means, but defining these using little tip boxes is a really easy way to get a more accurate answer. Number 5, and this is the last one I'll share before I hand it over to Maisie, is that clarity can be more important than brevity. So there's a common assumption in plain language work that being short and concise, using fewer words is always better. And while that's true, it's important to be concise. We heard consistently that people appreciated having more explanatory text if it helped them understand the notice better. So for example, there's a SNAP change reporting rule that says you need to report changes by the 10th of the month after the change happens. It's kind of like you have to think about what does that mean in practice. So we just added an extra sentence anytime that rule comes up that says, for example, if a change happens in June, you need to report it to us by July 10th. And even though it's one extra sentence to read, clients said this immediately helped them understand the requirement. And finally, there have been a lot of big policy changes to the safety net this year, particularly with SNAP and Medicaid. And it's important to explain to clients what these policy changes mean to them. So those of you who are familiar with SNAP policy know there have been changes around work requirements for able-bodied adults without dependents and how confusing these can be for clients. And I won't get into the weeds of that complex requirement, but I'll just explain how to approach kind of complex policy changes like this. What we did is sort of naming explicitly the group of people who you feel like will be most confused reading this. Like maybe the group of people the rule doesn't neatly apply to. For SNAP, this is there's been a lot of changes around 60 to 64-year-olds now fall into kind of a weird middle category between two overlapping work requirements. And we name that explicitly to say, if you're 60 to 64 years old, you need to follow these rules actually. And it would have been less text, less to read to not name that explicitly, but it also means that someone who's reading that might have no idea what this notice really means for them without it. So we opt on the side of it's always good to have more detail when it's needed. And now for our last insight, I'm going to hand it over to Maisie to wrap us up.
Thank you, Isabel. Hi, everybody. My name is Maisie Palmer. I'm a senior analyst at the Public Policy Lab, and I've been leading the childcare assistance stream of the work we've been doing with Arizona. This final insight, we've handed over to me because I'm really talking about a bit of a zoom out kind of insight, which really relates to how we situate notices in a wider ecosystem of communications. We can't separate a single notice from the notices that go before it or after it, and also those other communication channels that inform clients about their benefits. So that's just to say that notices are relational and they form key milestones in a client's program journey when they're sequenced together. And this is the context that shapes how clients really comprehend and understand the letters that they receive in the mail. So I'm going to give you some examples now of how we've thought about notices kind of in that wider context. So as Karina mentioned earlier, we started with a pretty large set of notices in the inventory. We had 167 for SNAP and 48 for childcare assistance. And for us, creating new versions of SNAP and childcare assistance notices really meant reconsidering the whole portfolio. So that's not just redesigning and kind of rewriting individual notices, but also looking at how for each program, would there be any redundancies, notices that were maybe duplications, or notices that could be combined, or maybe they were outdated and they needed to be retired from the set. So we kind of looked at that and streamlined it to make sure the kind of program journey for the client was kind of as simplified as possible. And also hoping that that had a secondary effect on supporting staff to identify the right notices at the right time and have less to select from. So another example of how we thought about notices in context, we paid special attention to the structure of information request notices. These are really important when it comes to any kind of benefits assistance programs because they really ask clients for the documentation they need to prove that they're eligible for notices. And here you have an example of a structure of information request we came across with DES. So where two notices actually might be sent out instead of one because text can sometimes spill over to a second notice. And here we're talking about that childcare assistance program that we shared earlier with the mainframe system. We could only limit text to one page. So if the worker who is inputting this and sending it out to a client has to select, say, 5 documents, there is a situation in which this spills over to a second notice that's mailed out in a separate envelope that could be delivered at a different time, which is really confusing for the client to receive because they might not be able to gather all that documentation at once and they might not be aware of what's kind of coming next in the mail. So we had to think about this and think about a solution for this specific structural challenge. So to tackle this, PPL reduced the amount of text on the notice itself and created a new enclosure called the document list. So that's on the next slide, Andrew. So notices now simply list the type of proof that's required. There's much less text on that page, more spacing. It's a little bit less visually busy for the client. But we then attached a new enclosure that basically lists different types of documentation that the client can choose from, a range of different documents that they can send in as proof. And this means that all information requests are now contained within that one envelope. So when the client receives this, there's just two pieces of paper in there, and they can gather their information all at once, and they don't have to wait for a second notice in the mail. So this is also a helpful kind of resource. We were thinking about this kind of in a broader context as well of this can stay with clients as a kind of consistent reference point physically and in the document center that DES have online. For moments when DES reaches out for updates or renewals, clients will always have this there physically as a reference when they need to gather documents. So before we wrap up, I'm going to dedicate a little bit of time now to just talk about some of the known and potential impacts of these redesigns, of these insights, based on some data we collected during pilot. So we did a process of A/B testing where we asked clients to basically compare an original to some redesigns that we'd done. And we saw a really clear preference for Public Policy Lab's redesigns. This is the data for childcare assistants, where you can see 71% found our redesigns easier to read, 75% preferred the layout of ours, and 82% preferred the tone. And in kind of UX design, where this method is used, numbers in the 70s and 80s indicate a clear user preference. But the goal of the pilot for us was to still identify what wasn't working and how we could improve the notices further. So even if we did this today, I'd like to think these numbers would be even higher. But a second point is that we see even stronger results here actually for Snap. There's a 10 to 11% point improvement. And that really is an interesting outcome for us as folks that work in kind of policy and visual design, because we know that the main difference here was that Snap had increased design capacity compared to those childcare assistance notices, which really speaks to, even though we were using kind of common language guidelines, so we were using text that was very similar, just the programs were different, but the kind of tone, all those big things, the keywords, they were very similar. This really suggests that clarified visual design really strengthens the impact of plain language when it comes to government communications. So that's just to say, if you're thinking of updating notices at your own organization or agency, it's really worth considering how a refined design system can strengthen clients' overall comprehension of that plain language text. They really work together and they amplify one another, which was a really interesting finding of this work. And we also wanted to speak about, kind of extend this a little bit further. We focused on client experience. That's what we were in there to do with DES. But we know that the benefits of this kind of work extends much further. And we were thinking a lot about kind of how can we bring operational efficiencies to the agency that we're partnering with. So I've got a couple of examples of how we might see boosts in client experience improvements in that generate kind of operational efficiencies. So here, when clients really understand what's asked of them and they know their required actions, there's likely to be less case delays and missed deadlines on the operational side. And where program requirements and form requests are much clearer, payments and submissions are likely to be more accurate. And finally, when next steps are obvious to clients, they're less likely to call on DES for support, so you probably expect to see a decline in call volume to support centers. So these things work together. Client experience extends, like improvements in this really extends much beyond kind of what the reader sees, but also kind of how the agency then kind of engages, I guess, with the client, and it changes how things operate. And finally, what we wanted to say was that the insights we shared today don't need to just be confined to letters in the mail. We talk about that full suite of communications, and these best practices can be scaled to the full suite of government communications. That might be digital benefits platforms, whether that's text notifications or internal agency comms. There's a lot of ways that these insights can be integrated and used across agencies. And I'm going to leave you with some exciting things that are on the horizon for us at PPL following our work with Arizona on notice modernization. So since we wrapped up this project, we have been working with the states of Oregon, New Mexico, North Carolina, Massachusetts, Vermont, and Delaware in an advisory capacity for a new tool we're creating at Public Policy Lab. We got some funding from the Public Benefit Innovation Fund, and we're developing an AI-assisted tool to generate compliant plain language snap notices. So essentially what we're doing is making the process we just did manually for Arizona. We're going to automate some steps of that process to make this much clearer and easier for states to kind of do en masse if they're kind of improving a suite of notices. We're trying to develop a tool at the minute that's going to improve that and make that much more efficient for states across the US. So Clara is something that's really exciting, and it's based on these best practices and guidelines from our work with Arizona. And this is really just a note that we want to leave you on today. So clarity is really a public good, and that's how we should think about it and frame it. So this is the way that agencies communicate their policies, their decisions to benefits recipients. And that really holds weight in fostering trust between governments and the people they serve. And clients really are owed and deserve this clarity, and benefits communications are really an integral pillar of that and an integral pillar of any service delivery. So we're about to release a zine. It's online now. We have a PDF that is talking about this subject of making notices clear, accessible, and efficient. And you can read more about it. I think Isabel's just dropped a link in the chat now, but it speaks to some of the points that we spoke to today, but this is a nice takeaway from today's webinar and today's session. And finally, something we wanted to offer you, if you'd like to have a more tailored conversation about benefits communications at your organization, perhaps some of the challenges you're facing, you can book a free 30-minute consultation with our team at this barcode, and we'll be there to chat to you, to workshop some of those challenges you're seeing and give a bit of informal advice. So yeah, that is the end of our webinar. We're going to take some time for some questions now. I think we've maybe had a few in the chat, but we can also give people a couple of minutes if they have any questions for us. We've got 15 minutes left, so we've got a bit of time.
If you want to raise your hand and ask a question, you can do that as well.
Yeah, we'll give people a couple of minutes.
I've unmuted Megan Jordan.
Hi, thank you so much. This is a great presentation. I wanted to learn a little bit more about, you mentioned a mental model, and it might be kind of intuitive on what that is, but I guess trying to figure out like someone's mental model or like a group's mental model.
Yeah, I can answer that. That's a good question. So when we talk about mental models, I guess we're thinking more about pre-existing definitions that people have in their head, pre-existing ideas people have about a program or a policy, sort of like what's already existing in their brain by the time they're reading a notice. And so a lot of what we did with people in testing was ask them, to look at, maybe we changed the title of a notice and we asked them, what do you think of this one? And sometimes people would actually say, well, this might make more sense to me, but I prefer this one because it's familiar to me. They come into it with different ideas about really what they're expecting to see. And sometimes that really dictates how they're reading. So we didn't really have a formulaic way of like testing for mental models. And it was more in the way that we would do these interviews as kind of semi-structured interviews with kind of these longer discussions, being able to probe into why people reacted a certain way to a notice or to a form, that we were able to understand a bit more of the why behind what they liked and what they didn't like, and then reflect that onto the page, if that makes sense. Ooh.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
I'm not sure where that little ding came from, but
I know I heard that earlier as well. We have another question here. This was asked early on by Michelle Chang, and this is, when gathering feedback from people, what was the process of recruiting users for testing? How do you ensure that users are representative of the general public that are receiving these notices? Would love to get an insight on that. Does anyone want to tackle that one? I can maybe come in. In terms of recruiting users for testing, there were a few routes. We worked closely with DES, and they put us in touch with some providers for childcare assistance side, but also some kind of big network organizations that had that supported clients on the ground that we call community-based organizations. So we essentially went through those kind of routes for people that their role in the community was to support clients to kind of access benefits. That's where we met people and clients that were either already using SNAP or childcare assistance or in the process of applying for them. So that was really helpful in terms of how we ensure those users are representative of the general public that are receiving these notices. Do you want to
I can
go into
speak to
that
that.
one?
Yeah. So we, I mean, the ding was from Andrew Eggman's audio. So we usually go into a project trying to understand what the demographics of that state or that kind of service user community is. And then we want to sample. At PPL, we try to sometimes oversample for communities that are not typically represented in policymaking decisions or positions of power. Like we said, our mandate is really to focus on low income and historically marginalized communities. So for us, we did want to speak to Spanish speakers. There's another question about Spanish speakers, but we knew we wanted to tap into that as a group in Arizona, as well as members of tribal communities. And then, as Maisie said, we really were working with community-based partners to get in touch with folks and really connect us with people that would be interested.
Thanks, Isabel. We'll go to that question actually, and maybe Andrew, you might want to speak to this one. I know you're involved with this. So, were there any differences that you noticed or needed to make between English and Spanish language notices? Andrew, do you have anything to say about that? I'm putting you on the spot, but I know you are Spanish speaking.
That's fine. Yeah, well, I should say I was the backup to our native speaker, Antonia Junge, who's not on the call today, but she really led the research with Spanish speakers and also the translation of materials. I think that the biggest difference was really about sussing out preferred verbs and nouns for the subpopulation of Spanish speakers in Arizona. Knowing that Spanish is a language with many regional variations, it was really important to use a neutral version of Spanish, but also specific terms that were resonant for that population. In terms of content, we really aimed for parallel content from a sort of straight facts perspective with the English version, and generally kept to the same type of document structure and layout, but accommodating the added word count necessary. 30% more space is typically needed to accommodate Spanish text on the page. So I think, yeah, it was a lot about using really regionally resonant and accurate terms, and also just correcting for machine translations or more basic translations that were existing in the materials. I think the example that comes to mind was just looking at materials that had been translated for the staff in the past. There were references to a hotline directing members of the public to call a hotline if they needed support, and that phrase was translated as linea caliente, which is literally hotline. Has no resonance. It doesn't make sense in Spanish. Should be something like linea de asistencia. So things like that we had to correct for in the existing translations, and then make sure that the verb and noun choices were really intuitive for folks that we were aiming to communicate to.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I think we have one more question about Clara. So the question was, will Clara be open source and free for states to customize more comprehensively for their own specific needs? Does anyone want to?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So I know I just had to touch none of us are working on the Clara project right now. So what the response from the other team is that they're in the process of defining what the business model is going to be. So the answer to the open source question will be out soon, but open source is a possibility. And so I think the timeline is that by summer 2027, they'll have a version 1 to launch. And right now it's in the kind of pilot stage with some advisory states capacity, advisory states giving sort of feedback along the way. And I think ideally right now it's a Snap specific tool, but I think the hope is that eventually it could become something more broad.
Yeah, and I would just add to that the piece about customizing for state specific needs. That's a part of the design work we're taking really seriously now during development of that product, where it's sort of become a bit of a trope to say that, of course, the human in the loop should always be in control in AI systems, but that can be a little bit dismissive. And I think what we're aiming to do is really understand who those humans are, who the folks in state and local agencies are that are making really crucial choices about the content that goes into notices, and then how they want to interact with an AI-based tool. And so that's where a lot of our kind of research time is going in now, is to understand what their hangups may be when it comes to using an AI tool for their work in communicating benefits policy and process via notices, and then designing the tool to meet those needs. I think there will be ongoing iteration, Jacob, to your question, as the tool rolls out, and understanding more kind of case specific nuances in how folks want to use the tool once it's live.
I'm gonna unmute Megan because she's got her hand raised.
I'm back. Did you encounter any instances where the client had fear of saying the wrong thing on the forms and losing their benefits? Like, what was there any of that? I would imagine there might be.
Yeah, we made it really clear to the clients we were testing with that the notices they were testing on, the notices they were like looking at with us were not real, and we were not, the state agency. So they weren't necessarily worried about giving the wrong answer to us because they knew it was a simulation of some sort. But we definitely heard the fear kind of consistently of, I don't want to give the wrong information on accident and have that impact my benefits. We definitely heard stories from people who, couldn't figure out how to submit their pay stubs, and then their benefits ultimately got denied, or they thought they had submitted something but they did it wrong, and a lot of that lived experience we heard consistently. So it's definitely there.
Yeah, I will add to that. I think a theme that we saw come through during our research was in response to that, in response to any kind of fear of them reporting inaccurately, we saw a lot of oversubmission. So the reaction would be, right, I'm not sure about this, so I'm going to send in many different types of proof, which of course actually is their kind of way of being kind of as safe as possible from their end, but that of course adds some kind of burden on the administrative side, which is quite that's quite difficult to navigate. So yeah, clients, even when we saw examples of just kind of because that mental model exists of kind of a fear of perhaps reporting inaccurately. Clients might still also reach out to the agency for support just to clarify, just to check, even if they actually, when we asked them what document would you send and they said the right thing, they would still be like, oh, but I would still maybe want to check that with the agency. So I'd probably call. So there is, some of those tendencies they're quite hard to break, and they can be things that have worked up over lived experience of years of having involvement with public benefits. So yeah, we did see that as a kind of response from the clients we were working with.
Did making the language more like human based help alleviate that some?
I think it definitely helped alleviate an initial emotional response or an initial feeling of panic for sure. It mediated some of it, but as I say, there were definitely some ingrained behaviors that are kind of override in those moments. And over submission was one of those examples, which again doesn't necessarily mean if someone's over submitting, it probably means that they will get the right benefit amount at the end because a range of documents have been sent. but it still makes the process, at some point, there's going to be a bottleneck, and that is kind of passed on to the agency. So yeah, thanks, Megan. They were great questions.
I would just add to that, the feelings of fear and overwhelm can be very closely related. And so to your question, Megan, about what sort of moved the dial or changed the experience, I think we heard that the visual redesign um, really helped to reduce that feeling of overwhelm, which can be an initial reaction to what feels like a wall of text. And I would say wall of text is a phrase we heard repeatedly in our conversations when asking people to kind of react to the original notices. So breaking down that wall of text into something that is more navigable and allows people to look at sections of text at a time. We certainly were able to do that with the sort of design features like Word, Microsoft Word offers. But even in a plain text design, we really worked to break up sections of text and use some of the techniques we've spoke about earlier, just numbered lists and more white space to reduce that feeling of overwhelm, which can be the start to a sort of a fear response, is just feeling like there's too much here. I don't know what it all means. It just looks official and scary. So sometimes changing that official and scary look is the first step to reducing the fear. I know we're at time. I just wanted to go back one slide in case folks want to continue the conversation and have another chance to scan that QR code. We're happy to continue this kind of conversation, entertain any kind of follow-up questions folks have. This group has a wealth of knowledge just coming straight out of this project and working on some other content design projects with PPL. I would love to share that or bounce ideas around if folks have questions or ideas for similar work that we could partner on. So thank you all. Isabel, I'll pass it back to you to officially close it out. I just wanted to end on that slide.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And please be in touch. We'll be around. Bye. Oh, and thanks to DES. Thanks, Stacy. Stacy's here in the chat, and Michelle.